He's making a list. He's checking it twice. He's gonna find out who was good at baseball or not. Last spring, I released the 4th annual Foolish 50. This is the video where I go back and I look at every pick and decide where I was right and where I was oh so terribly wrong. I think overall, as we're going to get into this list, we're going to see this was in some ways the worst list I ever put together, but also in some other ways, the best list. We'll just have to see what I mean by that. Gerrit Cole was my pick for the 50th best player in Major League Baseball going into 2024. Sort of an honorable mention type pick. At the time, we knew that he was going to miss about half the season. MLB Network did not. That's why they ranked him at 9th on their 2024 iteration of the list. You can see that the top right corner of your screen. But Gerrit Cole ended up missing half the year, but of course he was the reigning AL Cy Young winner. Let's talk about his 2024. This will be a good introduction to the cards. I've made one of these cards for each player on the list, and we're going to go back and we're going to take a look at each and every single player on the list, plus some others, plus some bonus players at the end of the video. I have these F-WAR tiers right here, if that makes sense. So, to be a top 100 player by F-WAR this year, you needed 3 WAR. To be top 50, you needed about 4. WAR isn't everything. It's tough when you're comparing, a pitcher to a hitter. It's also tough when you're comparing like a glove first, base stealing player to just a one-dimensional masher, and we'll see some of that as well. So I don't rank entirely based on how I think players are going to rank in WAR, but I mostly do. I mostly do with some, exceptions, because F-WAR isn't everything, especially because I think ultimately results, so like an RA9 WAR, like reference WAR, is sometimes better for looking back at past performance for pitchers, at least. As far as Cole goes, we knew we were only getting about half a season out of him, and it was kind of a subdued half a season, if that makes sense. Seems like he really sort of started to ramp things up in the playoffs. He pitched very, very well in the playoffs. That's not to say a 3.41 ERA or a 3.69 FIP are bad, but it felt like he was sort of gearing up, sort of saving things in the tank, and he did pitch really well for the entire Yankees playoff run, just maybe he didn't field his position all that well when it really mattered. Number 49, Vladimir Guerrero Jr. Thank goodness I had him on my top 50 at all. I mean, at 49, he barely scraped his way into this list for me. He was actually not in MLB Network's top 50 technically. They had him at 52, so we were pretty close. But we will be looking at players who are in my top 50, but not in MLB Network's, and vice versa. And this is going to end up being a big win for me because Guerrero did not put up top 50 value in 2022 or 2023, but this year he crushed it. There were a lot of great individual performances, specifically among American League position players this year, and so maybe Vladdy on an ultimately disappointing Blue Jays team didn't get a lot of shine, but in a lot of ways, this season was right on par with his 2021 breakout season when he finished runner-up in MVP voting to Shohei Ohtani that year. I mean, this is a great slash line overall. 323 average, 544 slug, a 165 WRC plus, where 100 is average. We have 30 home runs on the year as well. Only thing is, he is sort of that one-dimensional masher type. He's not going to have a lot to offer on the base paths or defensively, but that's okay because he absolutely crushed the ball this year, and there were signs that he was getting kind of unlucky in 2022 and 2023, and I'm glad I was able to sort of parse through that data and ultimately have him on this list in 2024. It really paid off because he had a massive year with 5.5 F-WAR. I also like to integrate viewer feedback into this reaction video. This is not just my reaction to my past decisions. This is also your reaction to my past decisions, and this feedback comes from the live stream premiere of the Foolish 50 list. So this is what people were saying right as Vladimir Guerrero Jr. hopped on their screens at number 49. Brian says, not a top 50 player anymore. Wrong. Not the Mauler says mid junior. Wrong. Like a Petter says, Vladdy's still on this list. He is. I was a little surprised too. I definitely considered having him off the list. MLB Network did not technically have him in their top 50. And then finally, Dev says, honestly, W. And honestly, W. Number 48, Nolan Arenado. I'm sure he's a lovely person in real life. I'm sure he tells charming anecdotes at parties. But this guy, let me tell you, from a ranking perspective, this guy's a big jerk. Look at my 2023 ranking of him. 5th. That was after a great year he had with the Cardinals in 2022. What does he do in 2023? Disappoints, down to 48. And honestly, this year, not much better. I'm not really sure what to make of Nolan Arenado's legacy, specifically in a Cardinals uniform at this point. because he's not getting any younger. He is 34 years old. He has played 4 years in a Cardinals uniform now, and only one of those years has been like really good, like one really good year in a Cardinals uniform, and the rest tend to look a little more like this. We have a 102 WRC plus, which means he was basically a league average hitter. 16 home runs on the year, so the power is definitely starting to wane a little bit as he gets into his mid-30s. The fielding run value, so this is StatCast fielding run value, which is the fielding component of FWAR, at +7, that is very good. Don't get me wrong, that's very good, but he has had better years. It seems like maybe the days of him being a, every single year win the Gold Glove Award type of guy are gone. He didn't win it this year or the previous year, so that adds up to a 3 FWAR season. I guess with WAR, you've got probably just a margin of error by about 1 either way. Maybe he was worth 2 wins or 4 wins this year. If he was worth 4 wins, then maybe you can argue him as a top 50 player based on these thresholds right here. But it's just a little bit disappointing, and I've never been able to accurately rank him in the past. So what's going to happen is next year, he's probably not going to be on the list, and then he'll have a great season because he is a big jerk. Dansby Swanson was one of those guys that I was surprised was on my own list. I know that sounds silly to say because I'm the guy that makes the list, but when I started to put together the list, I didn't initially think, oh yeah, Dansby Swanson will probably be on there. I mean, it would have made more sense for him to appear on the list in 2023 when he didn't, but that was when he came off a career best year with the Braves and then had just a fine year in 2023 with the Cubs. And this year, another fine year as well. He got top 50 FWAR, but I'm not really sure if how he did it is conducive to a ranking next year. I mean, if you really want to split hairs and talk about literal decimal points of WAR, which I don't recommend at all, he had 4.3 FWAR on the season and 3.9 gets you top 50. I mean, at 4.3, he's probably right around the 47th best player by FWAR on the year. So in that sense, I'm right. But in a lot of other ways, I'm wrong. I saw a lot of things in his hitting profile in 2023 that I liked, and those didn't really come into fruition in 2024. He was a league average hitter. The FWAR, a lot of that is generated by the fielding. He's a great fielder. He won the Gold Glove Award at shortstop in 2022 and 2023. Didn't in 2024, but certainly had a case for it with +14 fielding run value from StatCast. That makes him, one of, if not the most valuable defensive players in all of Major League Baseball the last few years. I mean, he plays great defense at shortstop, despite the fact his arm isn't really that great, at least by, Major League shortstop standards. It's not a standout quality for him, but for MLB Network, they ranked him at 67th. I had him at 47th. I guess you could kind of consider this a win for me because he did surpass that FWAR threshold. But of course, I'm going to be the first guy to tell you that's not everything, and there's certainly a margin of error at play here. Here's some viewer feedback on Dansby. I think people were maybe a little bit surprised he was on the list, but I didn't actually get a ton of negative feedback about it, which surprised me a little bit. This guy was excited. Luke said, good spot for Dansby. Whoa, good spot. Dang, really? I mean, that's just, really more surprised, if anything. So, even though it seemed like a little bit out of a left field pick, because maybe it would have more sense to have him on the 2023 iteration of the list, the feedback I got from you all was mostly positive, maybe pleasantly surprised. Number 46, Max Fried. This was a case where I was basically right in line with MLB Network's ranking. They had him at 48th. He will be a free agent this offseason. I think he will command a pretty good contract, and that's because run prevention is the name of the game with Max Fried. A lot of times, if you just go back and look at maybe the last 5 years or so, look at a minimum amount of start threshold, and he will be up there with the very best pitchers in baseball in terms of run prevention, and that's what ultimately matters when you're talking about pitching. This is a fine year. This is a perfectly fine year. I don't know if it is completely befitting of a top 50 player in baseball. I think we'll see with a lot of my pitching rankings, especially those players in the 40s and the high 30s, just a lot of fine years, maybe not incredible years, but like good years, right? 29 starts, 174 innings pitched. Volume is very important to me. A 3.25 ERA, 3.33 FIP. Even if the stuff doesn't absolutely blow you away, he is effective in the sense that he doesn't like to allow runs. That is Max Fried. Paul Goldschmidt is the first player on this list so far that I would say had a not good season. We've seen players have seasons that were either befitting of a top 50 spot or at least close enough that you could argue it. Paul Goldschmidt, not the case here. When you look at where he's at on the aging curve, it seems like he's about done. He's done a lot of great things in his career, but I doubt he will appear on this list ever again. It's just not what you're looking for a guy 2 years removed from an NL MVP award in 2022. In 2023, he did take a step back statistically, but under the hood, like that barrel rate, that chase rate, the contact rate, I still liked what was going on. So even despite where he was at the aging curve, I decided to give him a spot on this list. I felt like the floor was there, and he just didn't have a very good year. I mean, 100 WRC plus, he was a league average hitter, which when you're playing first base really isn't all that valuable. 22 homers, 11 steals. He's always been a little bit of a sneaky base stealer, so I do respect that, but it's 1.1 F4. He is a free agent now. I kind of think what he should do is just ring chase, to be honest with you. Sign a 1-year contract with the best team that you could, possibly get consistent playing time for, and just try to chase down that ring, because, as bad as this year was, I don't want to disrespect him at all. I mean, he's had basically a Hall of Fame career, and if he can end it on a high note by ring chasing with maybe a different team, I'd like to see that. But I don't think we will see Paul Goldschmidt on a future Foolish 50, barring a massive late career turnaround. Number 44, Aaron Nola. This was a surprise inclusion, and this was a bit of a gamut, because Aaron Nola, if you look at some of the peripheral under-the-hood type stats, he's very consistent. If you look at his ERA, he's not consistent, and there were some elements at play for that, particularly in 2023. I think having, Schwarber be a full-time DH in 2024 with Harper back playing the field at first base could have made a big difference for him. MLB Network didn't have him ranked in the top 100. What could I have possibly done to rank Aaron Nola in the top 50? So did my gambit work? Did my attempt to rank a player in my top 50 that wasn't even in MLB Network's top 100 give me a big advantage and make me look like I'm a smart boy with a very big brain, and make the folks over at MLB Network look like not so smart boys with very small brains? Well, I look for volume a lot when it comes to pitching. There are a lot of pitchers out there who can give you, ace-like stats on a rate basis, maybe across 120 or 140 innings, but to me it means a lot if you can do it across 180 or 200 innings, and Nola is one of those rare breeds in today's Major League Baseball where you could reasonably expect him to throw 200 innings in the season. This year he threw 199, but on a rate basis, you look at it, strikeout rate, walk rate, home run rate, it was good. Like, don't get me wrong. These are good stats. A 3.57 ERA, you take that. A 3.94 FIP. We got the stuff plus here and the location plus. This is the Eno Saris pitch grading model, 104 at 105 respectively. Those are all good. 3.2 F4. It's just not. This is a pattern we're going to see with a lot of the pitching I have in this ranking. There's a lot of volume here, but you're just not sure. It's not totally like knocked it out of the park. Obvious top 50 player, and I do think there will be a shakeup in terms of the pitching rankings going into the 2025 iteration of this list. Bo Bichette. Bo Bichette is one of those guys who in years past I've almost begrudgingly included on the list. He's lived in sort of the 40s the past couple years, and I think even 3 years ago I didn't include him on the list at all, even though I knew that was going to be sort of my most controversial omission. MLB Network had him ranked at 35th, and this year, it just all fell apart, man. It really was a really bad year for Bo Bichette. Let's talk about it. He was always a little fringy for me because despite his youth and despite, how great he was his first few years in the big leagues, you're talking about a guy who strikes out a fair clip and doesn't really walk much at all. Talking about a guy who, maybe isn't the best defensive shortstop, but would still put up enough value to justify an inclusion on the list. This year, that did not happen. I think you can maybe look at an injury-shortened year like this with some amount of scrutiny. I don't think this necessarily has to represent what Bo Bichette is going to be going forward, but this was a very bad year. Played 81 games, a 71 WRC plus on the year. That is well below league average. 277 on base, 322 slug, only 4 home runs and 5 steals in those 81 games. So that power speed element was gone from his game as well. And that added up to basically just being a replacement level player and nothing more, sadly. Number 42, Zac Gallen. Another case where I maybe cared a little too much about volume, particularly past volume. I maybe just saw a guy who could throw 200 innings and was like, yep, that's going to be on my list, all right. Don't get me wrong, good year for Zac Gallen. He's a good pitcher. He, of course, had a nice run with the Diamondbacks in 2023 that allowed him to end up on this list for 2024. MLB Network had him ranked at 31st, so it's not like, they thought poorly of him. But let's take a look at Zac Gallen's stats for the year. This is a good season. Zac Gallen's a good pitcher. I'm not exactly kicking myself for including good pitchers in my top 50. None of these pitchers that I've ranked so far have crashed and burned, really. We have seen a couple position players do that. None of the pitchers have so far into this list. And yet, I think if I were to levy some criticism towards myself in my ranking process, maybe it's just not imaginative. Maybe I should have taken like a home run swing on someone with clear Cy Young upside, but maybe didn't have the track record of someone like Fried or Nola or Gallen. As far as Gallen goes, he missed a couple starts, so only 148 innings on the years. But the ratios look good, especially that .8 homers per nine. That's pretty impressive. He had a 3.38 FIP, which I think if you look at FIP among starters, that's going to be one of the better marks in all of Major League Baseball this year. ERA a little bit higher. That makes sense when you consider that the offensive environment in Arizona can be a little bit above league average as well. 2.8 F4 on the year. That is Zac Gallen in 2024. Pete Alonso is a player I've actually been really bullish on in terms of ranking in years past. I believe it was 2022 specifically when I included him on the list when it might have been unpopular to do so at the time, and it ended up paying dividends. He ended up having a very good year that year. I like Pete a lot. I kind of let his 2023 be a little bit of a mulligan because he dealt with injury and the Mets really rushed him back from injury after he hurt his hand that year. So I thought for 2024, let's give him a mulligan. Let's give him a similar ranking, 40 versus 41, and see what happens. And ultimately in 2024, he delivered this season, which was good, but maybe not quite the season he was hoping for in his contract year heading into free agency. It seems kind of silly to complain about 34 home runs and a 122 WRC+, but we have seen him do much better in both of those marks at points in his career. He's still not a great defensive first baseman. I know it's something he has worked hard to be at least average at, but he was -6 on the fielding run value according to StatCast this year, and that added up to just a 2 F4. So theoretically, because of the defense, he was actually more of a league average everyday player than, say, a top 50 player. And I have some predictions for Pete. I think what's going to happen is he's going to end up with his free agency going the way of maybe like a Dansby Swanson or a Cody Bellinger. And by that, I don't mean he's going to end up a Cub. By that, I mean he's going to be the guy with obvious holes in his game that everyone's going to dump on, and every front office is going to be like, you're stupid if you give this guy a big contract. That's going to drive down to demand, and I think whatever team will sign him will probably sign him for a reasonable amount of money and get a reasonable performance, probably something like this one for the next few years. This is going to sound like cope, but I don't think I got fooled by a 2023 playoff Linsanity run from Adolis Garcia. I was a big fan of his before that. I had observed year-over-year improvements in the regular season. Every year he played Major League Baseball, especially with regards to the plate discipline, everything he was doing just seemed to be getting more sustainable. He seemed like he was getting better every year. The defensive metrics were there for him as well. And this year, it just didn't happen. Didn't have a very good year at all. Adolis Garcia may be smiling in this player photo, but look closer. Look at the eyes. There's a sadness in his eyes, and I think that sadness is because he only had a 284 on base percentage and a 92 WRC+, which is below the definition 100 league average. And -11 fielding run value from StatCast was my biggest takeaway. It seemed like, at least in the eyes of the metrics, which aren't everything, but at least in the eyes of the metrics, his defensive value cratered, and he was never the most graceful outfielder out there, but he would usually make up for it because he's got a cannon arm. So he has this huge arm, and he'd get a lot of outfield assists, and this year he just didn't really excel defensively at all. I mean, this is a guy who had played center field for a good portion of his career in a Rangers uniform, now kicked over to right field for most of the year, and -11, that's really bad. That's one of the worst outfielders in the league, and that is ultimately what added up to -0.2 F4, so slightly below replacement level. Yes, he may be smiling in his photo, but there's a sadness in all of our eyes. Looking at the viewer feedback here, more mixed to negative than positive. ManDude123Go said, I would say Adolis is at least top 35, but these other two did not share the same sentiment. Said not even top 75, going to regress, shouldn't even be ranked. These two ended up being correct. A lot of you watching this video are probably selfish. A lot of you watching this video are probably urbanites between the ages of 20 to 40. A lot of you probably have left-wing political beliefs, but you don't really identify with the Democratic Party at all. A lot of you have those feelings, and a lot of you think, hey, you know what we need to rebuild our society? Walkable cities. And you know why that's selfish? Because some people hate walks, all right? And George Kirby is one of those people. 1.1 walks per 9 innings. With these ratios right here, he's basically telling you he'd rather allow a home run than allow a walk. I mean, at least you have to earn a home run, right? George Kirby, love him because of the volume, and the volume is because of the efficiency and the lack of walks. You don't see that many young pitchers with this much of a commitment to getting to that volume, but he is there with 191 innings pitched this year. A 3.53 ERA, that's really good. I will say, league-wide offense was a little bit down this year. Seattle has tended to be a ballpark that is more pitcher-friendly than hitter-friendly. And so that 3.53 ERA, if you look at it on like a plus model, is probably like a 109 ERA plus. So not incredible, but you know, the Eno models, the Stuff Plus and Location Plus, love him. He's one of the best command pitchers in Major League Baseball. He's been that way since he got drafted, basically. It's just as a professional. 3.26 FIP is very impressive. 4.2 F4 does put him in the top 50 based on that top 50 threshold of 3.9. I could have gone with probably a couple other Mariners pitchers, but I went with George Kirby here at number 39. He's my favorite of their top guys, and he didn't make me look stupid. It might not have been a Cy Young season, but he didn't make me look stupid. Number 38, Luis Robert Jr. He plays for the greatest franchise in all of baseball, the Chicago White Sox, and you know what? I'm going to give myself a little bit of credit here. I'm going to pat myself on the back because if not me, then who else? In 2023, I ranked Luis Robert Jr. in my Foolish 50, and that was a very risky take. He had not played really a full Major League season at all in his entire career, but I saw the talent. He had a great 2023, and so this year MLB Network says, oh my gosh, we messed up. We're done. We got to rank him 27. I say, let's pump the brakes a little bit. Let's pump the brakes. 38. He looks good in that hat. The main thing with his 2023 breakout was, even though he had a great year, he had like a 5-WAR year, the way I didn't love it. The strikeout rate was back up, and in 2022, in a small sample, it had been about 20%, then it was back up to 30%, and that's why I was a little bit more hesitant with ranking him. I only bumped him up 10 spots when MLB Network probably bumped him up like 50 spots, for example, and at the end, some of my worst fears were realized. Only a 224 average, 278 on base, 379 slug. That adds up to an 84 WRC plus, 14 homers and 23 steals. Only played 100 games as well, and of course injury has been part of the narrative with him as well. Fielding run value of 0. That means league average at center field. That doesn't mean he's terrible. That just means a league average center fielder. At times, he has been closer to a Gold Glover at center field, so that's a little bit of a disappointment. And that adds up to just a 0.5 F-WAR to follow up a 5 F-WAR season in 2023. So a bummer of a year for Luis Robert Jr. I don't know if he's got a chance to be re-ranked in the top 50 again. I'm still a big fan of his. I don't want to, totally discount the fact that he did play for the worst team in baseball history, and that maybe a change of scenery would help him out a little bit as well, but this was obviously a disappointing season for La Pantera. Number 37, William Contreras. Yes. Yes. Do it to him. That's right. Yeah, this is my house. This is my list. 81, MLB Network. Throw it in the trash. Yes. Yes. That's right. When a young player has a breakout season, you ultimately have to decide, well, is this for real? Am I all aboard full steam? Or am I going to proceed with caution? In this case, I was all aboard full steam ahead. Number 37, William Contreras follows up a great breakout 2023 season with the Brewers with an excellent 2024 as well. 131 WRC plus on the year. You're not going to find many catchers who can do that, especially ones that play 155 games, so he's getting DH days in there as well. That's a huge workload for a young player, and he's just a great hitter. 23 homers on the year. The catching defense improvements have been documented on this channel as well. Even a -1 for him is a win. That basically means he's a league average catcher. That's the thing that it seemed like he was never going to be when he was with the Braves. And so shoutouts to the Brewers catching lab there. 5.4 F4. I think William Contreras has very convincingly made his case for being the best catcher in Major League Baseball this year. I am so glad and so proud that I had him on the list. Time for some viewer feedback. This was a very popular comment with 37 thumbs up. So even though you might not have said it out there, viewer, you thought it. You thought it. You committed a thought crime. Scrub J said, William Contreras in the top 40 and Will Smith not on this list is an absolute crime, Bailey. No. 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 And then Justin says, 'cause Wild Bill is a G and Will Smith isn't. Yes. Yes. Scrub J, if that's an absolute crime, then lock me in jail and throw away the key, brother. I feel like Pablo. I did that joke last time when I did the original video. I just felt like doing it again. Pablo Lopez, of all my pitching rankings here in like the 30s and the 40s, this one probably went the worst. I was a big fan of his arsenal, but things just didn't really quite work out for him for a lot of the year. There was maybe some bad luck with regards to the peripherals. There was maybe just not getting a full command of that arsenal that he showed in 2023. And to be honest with you, there are things that happened to Twins pitching this year that I just haven't quite been able to comprehend just yet. Given that we're still in kind of the early stages of this list, like the first third of this list, one of the key questions you got to ask yourself for every player is, was this season good enough to justify their inclusion in the 2025 iteration of the list? And for this season for Pablo Lopez, I must say, at least at a surface level value, I'd have to say no. 185 innings, good. 4.08 ERA. I'm not going to act like this is like a terrible pitching year. I'm not going to act like 3.2 F4 is a terrible pitching year, but it's just not quite what we were looking for. There is some discrepancy there with regards to the 3.65 FIP as well. Pablo Lopez, still a big fan of his, but this wasn't quite what I was looking for, and that's ultimately how I would summarize the year for him. Still, no real crash and burn yet as far as the pitching picks go. The hitting picks, it's a little bit of a different story. Number 35, Michael Harris II, not Jr., the second. This was actually his first appearance on the Foolish 50. You would have thought he would have shown up in 2023, coming off a Rookie of the Year season in 2022. And even though his 2023 was in many ways worse than his 2022, he improved in a lot of the areas that matter to me. I thought in his rookie year, he was hitting too many ground balls. Everything he was just getting on top of it and grounding out to the right-hand side of the infield. He was chasing a lot. The ratios and the strikeouts and walks weren't great. And there were improvements there in 2023, and that's why I ranked him 35th going into 2024. Unfortunately, despite those under-the-hood improvements, it didn't really work. Like 2023, this was another injury-addled year for Michael Harris II. Played in 110 games this year, was effectively a league average hitter across those 110 games. Despite that, he can be a very valuable player while being a league average hitter because he's such a good defensive center fielder. 2 F4 on the year is not bad across 110 games. That means, closer to 3 F4 pace across a full healthy season, but still a little bit disappointing, and we're seeing that with some of the position players so far. We're seeing some level of disappointment here in the 40s and the 30s element of this year's Foolish 50, and that's a little bit of a bummer for me, and we'll just have to see if Michael Harris has a chance to end up back on this list heading into the spring of 2025. Kevin Gausman had been one of the best pitchers in Major League Baseball over the last few years heading into the 2024 season, but this was his first appearance on the list. As you can see, he was unranked in 2023, and ultimately this year represented a bit of a step back, and we'll see that that step back came in a few key areas with regards to some of his peripheral stats, and I think the tricky thing might just be that splitter. That splitter, when it's on, it's really good. You can see it in the video right there. The problem is, it's a little bit of an inconsistent pitch at times. Truth be told, the fastball was probably a bigger problem for him. He'd had a lot of success with his fastball, particularly in 2023, and I was a little bit surprised by that because there are some characteristics of his fastball that are kind of unimpressive, and the location can be often down the middle for him. And so this year, the big thing, though, is the strikeout rate. 8.1 strikeouts per 9. This is a guy who is typically putting up double digits in that regard. His strikeout rate fell a lot year over year between 2023 and 2024, and I find that concerning. Ultimately, it's hard to argue 181 innings, pitched 3.83 ERA, 3.77 FIP. These aren't bad numbers. Like, I don't want to act like these are bad numbers, but again, this is the trend we're seeing with some of the pitching picks. Maybe it's not the Cy Young upside we were hoping for when we put a guy like this on the list. There's not a lot of crash and burn, but it's just not quite what we had in mind, and that is adding up to a 2.9 F4 season for Mr. Kevin Gausman. Number 33, Sean Murphy. This was an ugly year. This was a really ugly year. I am spared just a little bit here in my comparison with MLB Network because they did at least have him on their 50, although they had him at 47 versus my 33. I had Sean Murphy as the second best catcher in Major League Baseball heading into this season. He had such a great first half with the Braves in 2023 that he was really in that best catcher in baseball discussion, and although he regressed some in the second half, I didn't really want to put too much stock in that. I thought overall he had a very impressive 2023, and I was expecting the same in 2024, and it didn't happen. He suffered an oblique injury on opening day, and that just sort of set him down a bad path all year. He ended up only playing 72 games, and in those 72 games, he wasn't very good. As you can see, 193 average, 284 on base, 352 slug, 78 WRC plus, well below average. He still is a good defensive catcher, and that's, I think, part of the value play here is that he plays good defense at catcher, and he has shown the ability to hit most years of his career, just not this one. I think going forward, it would be very hard to justify including him on the list in 2025. That said, I do still like him, and I'm saying this, as a Braves fan, but also a baseball person. I still think there's a lot of good things happening in the profile here, and you could expect to maybe see him be one of the 5 players I like next year as sort of a consolation prize. I do believe in the bounce back. I just don't think you'll see him on the list in 2025 because this was just a disaster of a season, to be honest with you. Number 32, Rafael Devers. I don't know how many players have been on every iteration of this list. There have been 4 lists across the last 4 years, but I'd have to think he's one of them, and it's been a pretty consistent spot for him to be around 30. You can see last year he was at 31, this year 32. MLB Network had him at 32 this year as well, and I thought early on in the year he was going to make me look kind of dumb. I thought maybe he'd put up like a top 10 type of season, maybe finish like 5th in AL MVP or something like that, but he did slow down the last couple months of the year. He was OPSing nearly 1,000 by August 1st, but ended up with an OPS around 870 instead. This is a very typical Rafael Devers sort of year, very typical Rafael Devers slash line. He did miss a few games. He has had some years where he's pushed close to like 700-ish plate appearances. This year, only 600. 134 WRC plus, 28 homers. The fielding value is something that's always kind of tricky to reconcile with him. Sometimes the metrics really, really hate him, and sometimes they're like, he's all right at third base. I don't know how much longer he'll play third base in his career. The Red Sox have him under a long-term contract. You have to think over the course of that contract, at some point he will switch to more of a first base DH type, although I don't quite think that's coming just yet. 4.1 F4. Again, this is very typical Rafael Devers, and I think if you look at the ranking, 32nd is justified, and I think he'll be at a similar position going into next season. Number 31, Yandy Diaz. If you're being a little more formal, you could call him Yandrew instead, but Yandy Diaz, one of the best hitters in Major League Baseball on a rate basis between 2022 and 2023, and as a result, he appeared on the Foolish 50 for the first time in 2024 with a ranking of 31. Had some great strikeout walk ratios. Obviously, he's big, he's jacked, he hits the ball hard. The question had been, can he hit the ball in the air consistently? It's sort of a similar profile to Vladimir Guerrero Jr. How did that gamble on Yandy turn out in 2024? Statistically speaking, it was definitely a step back compared to where he'd been at between 2022 and 2023, and this is why at the very beginning of this video I said, in some ways, this is the worst list I've ever put together because we're seeing a lot of that with regards to the hitters in particular. We've seen some crash and burn in the first 20 or so spots on this list. We've also seen guys like Yandy Diaz who didn't necessarily full crash and burn, but just not a top 50 season. And when you're ranking players in the top 50, you want them to have top 50 seasons. 341 on base, 414 slug. That's a 120 WRC plus on the year. He'd been, pushing more like 150, 160 in previous years. So obviously that's a pretty serious decline. 14 homers in 145 games. He has the raw power to do a lot better than that, But again, he had been successful, being like a 15 to 20 homer guy anyways, so that's not even maybe the biggest alarm bell here. 1.9 F4, that basically makes him a league average everyday player. Obviously, when you rank someone in the top 50, you're hoping for better than that. Number 30, Alex Bregman. Little discrepancy here. MLB Network had him ranked at 44th. I had him at 30th. He's a fun comp to make with Devers because a lot of times they end up putting up similar WAR, but doing it in very different ways. This was a contract year for Bregman, and although he hasn't reached the peak of his 2018 or 2019, he has sort of reached a pretty similar level since. I would describe his 2024 stats as Alex Bregman-y. That is the adjective I would use. This is an Alex Bregman-y stat line, with one exception, the on-base percentage, 315. That's close to league average, but usually he's not league average. Usually you'd expect him to be 20, 30, 40, 50 points ahead of league average, so maybe that's a cause for concern. Maybe not as disciplined, at least in terms of drawing a lot of walks, as he has been in previous years. 118 WRC plus, about what you'd expect for him. I'd say, you'd expect about a 120, 125 in that area. It's just that he's well-rounded. 26 homers on the year, plus 5 fielding run value. He's a good defensive third baseman. He has shortstop background, and I think guys with shortstop background tend to make pretty good third basemen once they do make that switch, especially if they can come up to the big leagues as a potential shortstop. 4.1 F4. Again, I comped him to Devers. This is very similar to Devers, just done in a different style. And we'll just have to see what free agency holds for him. I think that may inform his ranking to some degree because he's shown a real propensity to pull that ball into the Crawford boxes and hit home runs when he's not a big home run hitter. I'm curious to see how another ballpark could factor into that. Number 29, Logan Webb. Coming into this year, there was a pretty clear top tier of pitchers that was, 4 pitchers if you include Cole. That was at least the case in a lot of, say, fantasy baseball circles. This isn't necessarily fantasy content, but the question would be, okay, who's the next best pitcher outside of that tier? And my answer to that question was Logan Webb. I love Logan Webb for the volume. This is a 200-inning-plus threat. You just don't see a lot of that in Major League Baseball. Let's see how it turned out in 2024. Believe it or not, even though he was incorrectly unranked on the 2023 Foolish 50, this is not his first appearance on the list. He was actually number 50 for me back in 2022, so I was actually kind of a Logan Webb fan before it was cool. This year, he had another great year, 204 innings pitched, led the league, 3.47 ERA, 2.95 FIP, which is nice. That's nice for the old F4, 4.4 F4. I think overall, if you're looking at starting pitchers outside of that top tier of those first 3 or 4 coming into the year, Logan Webb was a very good answer for who should follow that. I'm glad I went with him. I'm glad that I even gave him a spot that was, higher from some of these guys that we saw in the 30s and the 40s, like Lopez and Nola and Fried. Like a lot of these guys were kind of bunched up, and I had Logan Webb ahead of them, and ultimately that worked out well for me. Now, I will say one thing, and people aren't going to like it. When I look at Logan Webb, there's kind of 3 things you can look at, right? And that's his strikeout rate, his walk rate, and his ground ball rate. That's kind of what makes him special. This year over year, between 2023 and 2024, strikeout rate a little down, walk rate a little up, ground ball rate a little down. So it's possible that despite great results, it's just being a great pitcher in general, his ranking next year may be something you disagree with. Gunnar Henderson. I had Gunnar Henderson ranked at 28th, which is better than MLB Network's ranking of 34th, but unfortunately, I could have ranked him higher if I wasn't such a pathetic, worthless, spineless coward, because kind of deep down, I knew this type of season that he had was possible, and I just didn't 100% buy in on it, and I should have when I had the chance. I mean, good gravy, look at this. I mean, there were 4 or 5 guys this year in the American League who had, like, a median MVP season. Like, if you look at all the MVP winners of the last 20 or so years, theirs would kind of be average or median in terms of the value they provided on the field. Only one of them can win it, unfortunately. But an incredible year for Gunnar Henderson. That 281, 364, 529 slash line looked real good. That 155 WRC plus from a shortstop. Are you kidding me? He did play more shortstop this year, which I think was a sort of a big part of the value for him, is that he managed to be a league average-ish shortstop, which carries a ton of defensive value. 37 homers, 21 stolen bases, adds up to 8 F-WAR. That puts him 5th in terms of F-WAR in all of Major League Baseball. 28th this year, most likely way higher in 2025. And what do you know? I've got the viewer feedback right here. Gunnar at 28 is a travesty. Top 10 season and bound. It's exactly what happened. Number 27, Corbin Carroll. MLB Network saw a gap between these two. They had Carroll at 18 versus Henderson at 34. I put the two reigning co-rookies of the year next to each other at 28 and 27. Thought I was making a point. Thought I was looking like a smart person, scratching his chin and pondering life. Carroll had a sexier rookie year, but I thought Henderson's was just as valuable in terms of what he did on field. And ultimately, I would have looked smart if I actually put Henderson ahead of Carroll. To Corbin Carroll's credit, it is a miracle that he ended up with these stats by the end of 2024. He looked so bad for the first half of the year. Everyone was like, oh, he jacked up his shoulder. He should probably just end the season early and get surgery and get that over with. Instead, he just catches on fire towards the end of the year and really salvages what seemed to be a very sad sophomoric slump. 107 WRC plus, he finished as an above average hitter. 22 homers, 35 steals. The defense actually improved year over year. I think he's become more comfortable, more competent in the outfield. He looks good in the outfield now, better than he did his rookie year. And that adds up to 4 F4. And I mean, the fact that he ended up with 4 F4, considering how his year started, is bananas. So could he fall on this list a little bit? Yeah, he could, but ultimately I have a lot of respect for what he accomplished. I just kind of wish I had Henderson ahead of him. MLB Network had Trea Turner at 16th, but who ranked him at 26th? That would be me. Trea Turner had a year ultimately befitting of that 26th ranking. I think you could make the argument, hey, he was about the 26th best player in baseball. It was a more consistent year for him, coming off an inconsistent, sort of typical first-year big contract jittery season with the Phillies in 2023. Let's check in on the stats for 2024. I don't know if Rob Manfred decreed it, but it seemed like every Phillies star player missed about a month at some point this year, just randomly missed a month. That happened to Trea Turner, 121 games played. Really nice slash line here. I like the 295 average and the 469 slug, adding up to a 124 WRC plus. That is very typical Trea Turner. 21 homers, 19 steals, and then a -2 fielding run value. That's pretty run-of-the-mill for him as well. He is not the best defensive shortstop, you'll see, and I think that does inform my ranking of him at times. I do tend to have him ranked a bit lower than the consensus or a bit lower than whatever MLB Network is doing, and that's because a lot of times you'll see the shortstops ahead of him are elite defensively, and so they can make up a lot of value even if he has a good bat and good base running. 3.9 F4 on the year. Honestly, if you pace that out to a full season, it's more like 5. So he had a very good year. 26th feels good to me. Probably a similar level going into 2025. There are a couple players in the 40s that we've talked about already that are reminding me of Marcus Semien, who I had ranked at 25th coming into this year. One of them is Dansby Swanson. He had a very similar year to Dansby Swanson, just at second base instead of shortstop. And then also Nolan Arenado, because Marcus Semien is intent on making me look like a dummy no matter what he does. He's been kind of doing this alternating, fine year, great year, fine year, great year. So I'm sure he'll be an MVP finalist in 2025, and I'll have him ranked somewhere stupid. So given the very established pattern of Marcus Semien good year and then Marcus Semien not so good year, this is what a Marcus Semien not so good year looks like. It's still a 4 F4 season. It's still top 50 in terms of F4 among players in the league this year. It's 718 plate appearances. That's one reason why he generates a lot of WAR every year, is because he's taken 700 plus plate appearances. It's crazy. He's a crazy Iron Man. And even though, his OPS was like 700 this year, even though his bat was league average, the plus 14 fielding run value at second base, he is a very valuable player, even when he's not so good. And when he's good, he's putting up, top 5 value in the American League at any given moment. So we'll see. He is getting up there in age, but I think it's very predictable that I will have him ranked either in like the 40s or not ranked at all, and then he'll be an MVP finalist, and he will laugh in my stupid, stupid face. Number 24, Manny Machado. Funnily enough, another guy who has been historically alternating good years versus great years. I thought he was due for a great year this year, and I'm not quite sure he got it. I don't know. Historically, I've done very well ranking Manny Machado versus MLB Network. This year, we were in full agreement. This year, we had him both at number 24. Padres had a really nice year. I know they're probably bummed out about the postseason outcome, but Machado didn't go nuts. And I thought, based on his 2023, he would go nuts, because in 2023, he played through a lot of injury and he sort of gritted it out, and he put up a stat line pretty similar to this one right here. And although there was a little bit of improvement, I thought maybe he'd get that WRC plus up back into the 130s or the 140s. I thought maybe, even though he's getting up there in age a little bit, he'd still be a plus defender according to the metrics at third base. This is a good year. I don't want to be too critical of this type of performance, but this is the type of performance that most likely drops him down the list a little bit heading into 2025. 122 WRC plus, 152 games, 29 homers, 11 steals, adds up to a 3.6 F4 for Manny Machado in 2024. We'll just have to see where he's ranked in 2025. Number 23, Jose Altuve, really hard player for me to rank, particularly this year. And the reason for that is, between 2022 and 2023, he had just kind of hit at an insane level. A level on a rate basis, quite frankly, pretty much in line with his 2017 MVP season. Despite that, though, obviously, aging curve is, trending downwards. His defense at second base has trended downwards. Maybe even the steals a little bit have trended downwards. How did he do in 2024? The answer is he did well. He did really well. He did about as well as I thought he would, based on where he'd been in terms of past performance and based on where he was trending in terms of the age. A 127 WRC plus is lower than, the 150s it had been between 2022 and 2023, but still very, very good for a second baseman. I mean, this is 295, 350, 439. This is a future Hall of Famer slash line. The fact that he's playing like this at this age, very impressive. 20 homers, 22 steals, 22, the most he's had since that 2017 MVP season. The defense is a sticking point for me as I continue to rank Altuve into the future. At -6, he is no longer a particularly good defensive second baseman. He was earlier in his career, but last few years, that's really been trending down. And even though playing second base in itself does have some value because it's an up-the-middle position, if he's not playing it all that well, maybe you can't, necessarily reconcile that with declining offense. Still, I'm very impressed. Still, 3.9 F4 puts him right on the cusp of that top 50 spot. He's an amazing player, and I think he will continue to trend well. Even if it's down, I don't think it's going to be a crash and burn situation. I think he's got his parachute on, and he's coming in for a nice soft landing. Number 22, Adley Rutschman, former number 1 overall draft pick, former number 1 overall prospect. He had 2 great big league seasons already under his belt coming into this year, and coming into 2024, I ranked him as my number 1 catcher in the game, and he took a step back. It wasn't a gigantic step back, but it was enough of a step back to make me think he may not have that title going into 2025. The hitting took a step back. He didn't walk as much as he did in his first couple years, and as a result, we see that on-base percentage in particular falling to .318, which is around league average. 104 WRC plus, also around league average. Not for a catcher, by the way, just all position players in general. He was more in the 120s and 130s in his first 2 years in the big league, so this does represent a step back. The catcher fielding run value, always important. Rated him as a league average catcher. At times, I think he'd been rated as an above league average defensive catcher, and that was kind of, a big calling card for him, was the fact that he was a very competent catcher coming out of college, and that really raised his floor, and that's one of the big reasons why he was drafted as a can't-miss number 1 overall guy. 2.8 F4 on the year. Overall, it's a perfectly fine year. Most teams would be happy to have their catcher do this. But, this is a guy who's a franchise player, and I think maybe Baltimore fans were hoping for a little bit more, and I hope they'll get a little bit more going into his 4th year in the majors. I had Zack Wheeler ranked at number 21. This was higher than MLB Network's ranking, and yet, based on the performance this year, for me, having him as the 3rd best starter in baseball is a little bit of a miss. I think going into next year, he has a very good chance to be ranked as the number 1 starter in baseball because, once again, he was brilliant. He was phenomenal. That is what he's continued to be all throughout his tenure as a Philadelphia Philly. Let's check in on the numbers for Zack Wheeler. Another 200-inning season, 2.57 ERA. That's pretty much how you can sum it up. 200 innings of 2.57 ERA ball. I suspect he will finish as the runner-up for the NL Cy Young behind Chris Sale this year. That said, I think you could definitely make an argument that he deserves to win the award because of the extra volume that he provided that Sale didn't. 5.4 F-WAR, was third among all starting pitchers. And the only thing that might scare me off ranking him as the number one pitcher in baseball heading into 2025 is the age. But I will point out, elite pitching tends to age pretty well. We've kind of seen that in recent years. Guys like Scherzer and Verlander, who have really continued to dominate in elite ages, older than Zack Wheeler is now. And so I think when you look at it, and if you say, 99th percentile pitching ages well in today's MLB, Wheeler could be a good indicator of that, and I look forward to what he has in store in 2025. Number 20, Corbin Burnes, ranked him one spot ahead of Wheeler. I was flip-flopping back and forth throughout this process. I went with Burnes because he had a really strong second half in 2023, and I hoped that the change of scenery would bode well for him going into 2024. This was his first, and potentially, we'll see how the free agency goes, only year in a Baltimore Orioles uniform. It was a very good year. It wasn't quite as good as Wheeler's year, but let's check in on the stats. 194 innings of 2.92 ERA ball. Can't argue with that. I would consider that to be an ace or ace-like performance. That said, going into free agency, the strikeouts, the whiffs, are a little bit of a concern for him. Maybe even a major concern, because going back to his 2021 Cy Young year, his strikeouts have decreased on a rate basis pretty consistently year over year for 3 years running now, and so down to 8.4 strikeouts per nine. That's not what you picture when you picture Corbin Burnes. That's not really what you picture when you're talking about a pitcher with a 120 stuff plus, according to the Eno Saris model. So, it's curious. Last year, I liked the second half surge, and that's why I ranked him ahead of Wheeler. This year, struggled with the cutter. Cutter wasn't doing the things that it normally does, and that's sort of his signature pitch. And then, once again, down the stretch, he starts to figure out the cutter again, and the cutter is becoming, his most important dominant pitch again, even though he had lost it for portions of the year. And so we'll just have to see. He does enough in the second half down the stretch to convince me that he should be ranked highly, and yet, in some ways, especially with regards to the strikeouts, which are going to be pretty predictive, the decrease is concerning, and that's heading into free agency for him. Fernando Tatis Jr. came in at 19th on this list for me. He was a very popular, maybe not so dark horse NL MVP pick for many. They saw his 2023 as analogous to Ronald Acuña Jr.'s 2022, both coming off of lost seasons for those great players. I will say there was a pretty big difference. Acuña had a lot better peripherals under the hood with regards to the bat. That said, Tatis was coming off a platinum glove. Ultimately, it was another sort of tease of a year. You're hoping he was teasing something greater yet to come. WRC plus of 135 was an improvement over his 2023. However, that was across only 102 games, so we didn't quite get to see the full season. 21 homers, only 11 steals. This is sort of an era of stolen bases. I would like to see him participate in that a little bit more, because we know how athletic he is and can be. And with the fielding run value of +2, that is still a step back based on the metrics he was putting up in his platinum glove year of 2023. Now look, across a full season, if he plays platinum glove level defense and has a 135 WRC plus and plays every game and maybe steals a few more bases, that could be, in some years, an MVP candidate or someone under MVP consideration. That just didn't quite shake out for him this year. Again, only 102 games played. 3.2 F4 is what he finishes with. But if he were to hit like this on a rate basis and really boost those defensive metrics in the outfield like they have been at his absolute peak, we could be talking about a 6-WAR season or something like that. Number 18, Bobby Witt Jr. My goodness gracious, what a season. We talked about this with Gunnar, the idea of like a median MVP season across the last 20 years or so. This was higher than the median. I think if you look at MVP seasons across the last 20 years, this was better than a lot of them. That said, I don't think he'll win it. It's just unfortunate the AL was so stacked this year. I actually doubted him a little bit after his rookie year because he seemed to lag behind Julio and Adley, who are in the same rookie class, but he's really taken over, and the defense is a big reason why. You look at these numbers, this is a Mike Trout season. This is like a textbook Mike Trout season, particularly sort of early career. And for him to have this 10-WAR season at such a young age, it's pretty crazy to think what he could do going forwards. plus 12 fielding run value. One reason why I ranked him at 18 and introduced him to the list at such a high ranking was because he shifted from being a minus shortstop to a plus shortstop between year 1 and year 2, and I expected that trend to continue. I thought he played great shortstop in 2023. He did it again in 2024. That's a big boost to his overall value. But I mean, look at this slash line. He hit 332, 389, 588. This is in Kauffman, by the way. This is a pitcher's park, and he's putting up these numbers. 32 homers, 31 steals. Once again, a 10 WAR season. It's such a shame because a lot of years this does win MVP, just maybe not this year, but incredible year for Bobby Witt Jr. I really think with a season like this, he at least launches himself into the conversation for #1 player in Major League Baseball. I alluded to Bobby Witt Jr. versus some of the other young stars who have come into the league at a similar time, at a similar age. Here's a comment from 7 months ago. Bobby Witt Jr. is the most overrated player in baseball right now. No way is he better than other young players like Adley, Gunnar, or Corbin Carroll. Desjardins stood on business. He simply said, no. Number 17, Kyle Tucker. Ooh. What you gonna do, Houston? He's a free agent after 2025. What you gonna do? Bregman's already a free agent. Frommer's gonna be a free agent soon as well. This isn't the youngest team. Altuve's not getting any younger. What you gonna do? I think if you don't give this guy a big contract, you're kind of signaling rebuild. I think that. We've talked about some of the great individual performances in the American League this year. This one was on its way. This one was on its way to being another one of those years. Sadly, it was only half a year, but if you were to extrapolate this across the full year, it's up there with guys, like Gunnar, for example, or even Bobby Witt Jr., somewhere in there. 78 games played, a 180 WRC plus. He got on base at over a 400 clip and slugged nearly 600. 23 homers, 11 steals. We've seen the defensive metrics make a little bit of a bounce back. I've always thought he was a good defender in right field. Some years the metrics haven't agreed. This year they have him at least at a +1. It's 4 FWAR in half a season, which would be like 8 FWAR across a full season, which would have put him right in that top 5. So at 17, I'm pretty happy with the ranking, but I think with the contract year coming up and just how he performed, even if it was a smaller sample this year, he's got a chance to shoot up the rankings because this is kind of a perfect storm scenario for him heading into 2025. I hope he gets paid. Some people think they're always right. Others are quiet and uptight. Others, they seem so very nice. Oh, inside they might feel sad and wrong. Oh no, 29 different attributes. Only 7 that you like. Oh, 20 ways to see the world. Oh, 20 ways to start a fight. Alright. Oh, don't give up. I can't see the sunshine. Oh, I've been waiting for you, baby. 'Cause I'm through. Sit me down. Shut me up. I'll calm down. And I'll get along with you. Francisco Lindor, if you're watching this, I understand you. These folks at MLB Network, they do not understand you. I understand you. 2022, you weren't in their top 50. Guess what? You were in mine. No problem. This year, number 25 for them, but number 15 for me. Even I underestimated you. But at the core of all of it, I understand you. All things considered, I would have to say this was the best year of Francisco Lindor's career. And that's a tough thing to say. He had some really good years with Cleveland, but this one was truly something special. A 137 WRC plus from one of the best defensive shortstops in the game. Nearly a 30-30 season. Adds up to 7.8 FWAR. He was in MVP conversation for almost the entire year. I think maybe those last 2 weeks kind of removed him from that conversation. I think he's going to finish comfortably as the runner-up in terms of the National League MVP this year. But man, what a year. Leading the surprise Mets to an NLCS appearance. Francisco Lindor, a round of applause for you. Some people thought Trea Turner was better. Those people do not know ball. It seems crazy to think that 7 months ago, ranking Lindor as the 15th best player in baseball might have been a pleasant surprise, right? Because he was one of the best players overall this year. But here are the reactions from the chat. W, Francisco Lindor, yes, let's go. But also some people not liking it. Martin Javier, not liking it. Fringe door, ooh, I think that's an insult. Javier Flores, keeping it simple, L. Number 14, Austin Riley, just a bad year, just the worst year of his career since he broke out in 2021. He slumped really first 2-3 months of the year. Braves offense as a whole slumped, but I thought he was maybe the most to blame for that out of anybody. Then he gets hot, then he starts to put up Austin Riley type numbers, but his season is cut short early by injury, so he's not able to fully fulfill that. The fact that he ended up with a 116 WRC plus still crazy considering how bad he looked first couple months of the season, but ultimately I think if he'd have finished the season strong, he could have very well ended up in the 120s or the 130s where he normally is. I think one reason, Devers and Riley are compared a lot because they're similar ages and they've exhibited similar amounts of production at time. One reason I tend to like Riley more is because I do think he plays better defense at third. I don't think it's like Gold Glove defense. There's some Braves fans that think for whatever reason he should win the Gold Glove sometimes, but a fielding run value of -3 is fine. I think he's probably about average-ish going forward at the hot corner. 19 homers in 110 games, 2.4 F4. He's going to drop, obviously. He's not going to be ranked 14th next year, but I think he has the potential to still maintain a pretty high ranking. I still got to believe, right? Am I biased? Maybe I'm too biased. The end of hunger, world peace, harmony among all races and religions, a cure for cancer. These are things that I think could be achieved if Julio Rodriguez would simply hit in April. Step back year for Julio after 2 great seasons. It almost mirrors what happened to Adley Rutschman this year. The two will always be a little bit interlinked. They were part of the same rookie class. They finished 1-2 in Rookie of the Year voting that season, and they are seen as franchise saviors for their respective American League teams. Adley has a better supporting cast, and I think the problem for Julio is he just puts himself under so much pressure to perform, and the problem is, when you look around at the rest of the Mariners lineup, maybe he's right to feel that way. Maybe he's right to feel that this has to be a one-man wrecking crew, a 116 WRC+, that is a little bit below the standard that he set in his first 2 years in the big leagues. 20 homers and 24 steals. We've seen him go 30-30 before. +7 fielding run value. That continues to be a very exciting facet of his game. I've talked about this multiple times, but he was such a big and strong athletic guy coming through the minors. I think there was just a reasonable expectation he would be moved to a corner spot at some point, maybe pack on some muscle. Instead, he's big and muscly, but he can play a plus center field, a really good center field, in fact, and that really affects his value in a positive way. 3.8 F4 on the year, more in the 5s range when he's at his best, but Julio, he's probably going to move down this list some, but obviously there's potential here, and I look forward to sort of digging deep down into things like his barrel rate or his chase rate to try to figure out just exactly what didn't quite go right in 2024. Number 12, Matt Olson. I think when you look at this area of the list, let's say the players, between 10 and 20, you either flopped or you went nuts. There weren't actually a lot of players in my 10 to 20 range that I would say finished as the 10th or 20th best players in Major League Baseball this year. In the case of Matt Olson, this was a little bit of a flop. He wasn't terrible, but it's not what people expected coming off a year when he was an MVP finalist. He continues to be an Iron Man, which is a good thing, 162 games played this year, but the 117 WRC plus and the 29 home runs are a massive departure from the standard he set for himself in 2023. In 2023, he hit 54 home runs, and I think we've seen him become kind of a sneaky every other year sort of guy, because dating back to 2021 with Oakland, he's kind of alternated between just all right, fine, and great seasons. So if the pattern continues, he could be in store for a great season in 2025. Otherwise, this simply is not a top 50 performance at all in Major League Baseball this year. And it's sort of the story of the year for the Braves. They had a lot of great star players that were part of a record-setting offense in 2023, and a lot of those players took a step back in 2024. Number 11, Jose Ramirez. I know I say this every year. My favorite player in baseball. Just a player that I watch with a childlike wonder. That is Jose Ramirez. Here is someone who has maximized his talent in every possible way. God gave him a body. It wasn't the best body. It wasn't the best baseball body, but he's become the best player he could possibly be within that body. You ever watch a baseball player and just think to yourself, oh, if they just made this small adjustment, or if they could just throw this one pitch, or if they could just change their swing in this way, or if they could just work on their defense just a little more, they're just one step away from this stardom. You never have to have that thought with Jose Ramirez. Never your entire life do you think, he's leaving some production on the table there, that Jose Ramirez. Nope, he just does this. You see this stat line? This is what he does. This is really what he's done for like the last 7 years, and that's a big reason why he's going to be, it seems, a Hall of Famer. He is on Hall of Fame pace in many ways. 158 games played this year, 141 WRC+, nearly a 40-40 season. He settles for 39 home runs and 41 stolen bases. A plus defender at third base, once again, never gets enough credit for his base stealing or his defense at third base. That adds up to a 6.5 F4, which would put him just inside the top 10. Sorry that I had you at 11, Jose. If it's any consolation, you are clearly the best third baseman in baseball. And what's fun about that is, competition is come and gone, right? Machado, Arenado, Chapman, Devers, Riley, these guys have all been relevant throughout this run of consistency for Jose Ramirez. In fact, in many years, Jose Ramirez has just consistently been the second or third best third baseman in the league in any given season. And I think what's fun about this year is that, no, he was just the best third baseman in baseball this year and has really just established that as a fact. Number 10, Bryce Harper. I'll keep it real with you. I thought he was going to win MVP this year. I thought it was going to be either him or Austin Riley. Although he's not going to win MVP, he still had a very good season, and it was in fact his first complete full season since he won the MVP award back in 2021. That was the second of his career. So first year at first base, full time for Bryce Harper. How did it go? It went well, and this is a very typical Bryce Harper sort of stat line. 285 average, 373 on base, 525 slug, 30 homers. I think that's sort of the platonic ideal Bryce Harper slash line right there. Adds up to a 145 WRC+. I think we should hone in on the defense, though. +5 fielding runs at first base. I'm not surprised he looked very competent there, in the second half of 2023. I'm not surprised that across a full season, he finished as a Gold Glove finalist for the award for first base in the National League. That adds up to a 5 F4 season. He came in ranked at 10th this year. I imagine he'll be ranked similarly going into 2025. We'll just have to see if he, drops from that top 10 or not. He could be, 12 or 13 or something like that. Not a big difference between the 12th and the 10th best player in Major League Baseball, and yet, when you talk about being top 10, it feels pretty significant. Oops. Whoops. Oopsie daisies. Uh-oh. Jeez, oh man. Uh-oh. Ooh. Ah. Now I really done did it, didn't I? I really did it. So it turns out Shohei Ohtani, as a DH only, mind you, was not the 9th most valuable player in all of Major League Baseball this year. I would contend he was not the first most valuable. There were guys in the American League who had some pretty killer years. I'd probably put him overall in Major League Baseball this year as like 3rd or 4th, which would make MLB Network's ranking of 4th pretty darn good. My ranking of 9th, not that impressive. This was a great offensive season for Shohei, first and foremost. 310 average, 390 on base, 646 slug, 181 WRC+. What was interesting is, for a lot of the year, he was actually slightly lagging behind the standard he set for himself in 2023 with the Angels when he was still pitching. Last year with the Angels, he led the American League, OPS plus or WRC plus or whatever, park adjusted metric you want. This year, he did do that for the National League, but he was behind that pace until really the last 2 weeks of the season, and then he just goes completely nuts. The stolen bases is the funny thing here, because if you go back and watch the original Foolish 50 video, I talked about how, I didn't like the direction his base stealing had gone over the last few years with the Angels and how I wanted him to be more efficient. What does he do? 59 stolen bases. And I don't think anyone's ever stolen 59 bases more efficiently than he has. I may need to go to StatHead Code Foolish 20 to double check that, but he was crazy, just efficient in terms of everything. And combine that with the 54 home runs, you of course have him as the founding and sole member of the 50-50 club, a feat that probably rivals, a certain someone who founded the 40-70 club just last year. So look, we're in an era of outlier power speed seasons, especially on an individual level, and Ohtani perfectly personifies that. It was just so fun to watch him say, hey, I'm not going to pitch this year. Let me focus on the hitting, and especially let me focus on the base stealing. Let me become a weapon there. 9 F4 as a DH only is just preposterous to me. It's absolutely preposterous. It's why I would not have picked him to win MVP going into this year, because first of all, a DH has never won MVP. As good as a hitter he is, it would be hard for me to picture a DH winning MVP. I'm almost a little bit upset that a DH is going to win MVP, except for the fact that it really just sort of developed in such a natural feeling way where, yes, Betts missed some time, and Freeman took a little bit of a step back, and Olsen took a little bit of a step back, and Acuña got hurt. So a lot of those guys you'd maybe expect to be in the mix in the National League just weren't up to their usual standards in the regular season for one reason or another. And that really just cleared a path for Ohtani to win MVP, perhaps even unanimously. We'll have to await that decision. But so if you went back 7-8 months ago, you told Bailey, hey, a DH is going to win MVP this year, I'd be like, game's gone. I wouldn't have liked it. I wouldn't have liked the idea of someone not playing the field yet winning the MVP award. And yet the way Shohei has done it, I feel great about it. I actually feel great. It has developed as naturally and as nicely as it ever possibly could. Here's the viewer feedback from when Ohtani showed up on the list at number 9 after being, of course, number 1 a year ago. A mixed bag, I guess, in terms of the feedback. One of the funnier comments is definitely 60 homer season coming. He didn't get to 60, but 54 homers and 59 steals is pretty darn impressive. I had Ohtani ranked as 9th, but I had some pretty good players ahead of him. So what I'm doing here is I'm just covering my eyes. I'm closing my eyes because I'm just really hoping that whoever I had ranked as 8th, for example, also had a really good year. So I'm just going to reveal that to myself right now. I'll see you guys at the other screen. I just hate it. I just hate it here so much. I don't want to be here. I don't want to be green screened into this card, into this world where this is possible. 4 straight years now, Mike Trout has just been injured. 29 games played this year. 139 WRC, but who cares? Who cares at this point? I mean, it is Ken Griffey Jr. in some ways, and yet in some ways it's not. I mean, Ken Griffey Jr. at least got to 600 career home runs. I don't think Trout's going to get there. And yet, when he plays, this iteration of Mike Trout in the 2020s still appears to be better than Griffey was when he was on the Reds. It's just killing me. And here's what happens. Here's what's so bad about it. He suffers an injury, and then it just gets worse, and it just doesn't heal. This happened with the calf strain a couple years ago. It happened again this year where he thought, oh, maybe he'll come back in the second half. He just never came back. We saw 29 games of him. In the first game, in his first at-bat, he had a home run off Corbin Burnes, and I was like, we're back. And then 29 games later, it's Jover. It's never been more Jover. I don't know where to rank him. I don't know. Can he be on the 50 next year? I don't know. I love him. I want the best for him. Mike Trout, please. Mike Trout. If you're listening, Mike Trout, I'm scared. I want you to save me from these people, Mike Trout. If you'd have asked me coming into this season, who's the best hitter in Major League Baseball, I think I would have told you Yordan Alvarez. And although it didn't quite turn out that way, he had another very good year. The reason I like him so much is he's such a pure hitter. He has such a high floor. crazy raw power, and yet not a lot of swing and miss, not a lot of strikeouts in his game, takes his walk, just a great, very balanced hitter across the board. Shohei obviously showed him up a little bit at the DH position, but I'm still pretty happy with Yordan at number 7. Because this is yet another really good year for Yordan with the bat. He doesn't have that much defensive value to speak of. He typically plays 30, 40, 50 games in the outfield and then spends the rest of the year DHing. This year, 147 games played, 635 plate appearances. Those are career highs. That was really encouraging. 308 average, 392 on base, 567 slug, 168 WRC plus. What's crazy is this is just kind of normal for him. This is just a normal level for him. That's how good he is. 35 home runs, that's normal for him. The 6 stolen bases is honestly the biggest outlier on this entire stat sheet. 5 F4 on the year. The one thing with Yordan is, and it's because he's such a pure hitter, and it's because he, tends to hit, 300 or close to it, and he doesn't strike out a whole lot, is I wonder if does he have a 50 home run season in him? He tends to stick around, 30, 35 for the home runs. He obviously has a lot of raw pop. He can obviously make a lot of contact. I wonder if he could someday just hit 50 home runs in a year, because he hasn't really gotten particularly close despite how good a hitter he is and his frame. Number 6, Juan Soto. Is he a Yankee for life? I don't know. I don't really know. In fact, I'm going to say it. I have some doubts that is going to be the case. He's, of course, the big free agent for this year, going to sign a contract, $500 million, $600 million, and the reason he's getting that big deal is that he just had a phenomenal 2024 season in pinstripes, probably the best of his career in a full season. He had an insane 2020, but it was only 47 games. It was a shortened season anyways, and he got COVID at the beginning of it, but this year, 157 games played, 288 average, 419 on base, 569 slug, a 180 WRC plus. What was key for him this year, and especially in terms of attacking the short porch in right field in Yankee Stadium, is that I wasn't sure if he was the guy to do that, because obviously he's a disciplined hitter. He's been a disciplined hitter every year of his career. The thing about him is, even though he hits the ball hard, sometimes he hits it too much on the ground. Sometimes he's had trouble pulling fly balls in the air. This year was the absolute best he's done at that in terms of pulling the fly ball in the air, not just hard contact, but hard contact at the right point with the right launch angles. And as a result, 41 home runs is a career high for him, and that has resulted in just a phenomenal season, a season that, and we talked about this with a few of the AL guys, is probably around a median MVP season across the last 20 years or so. The fielding run value is kind of interesting. His arm was good this year. He had a lot of outfield assists, particularly early out there in right field. That said, I still think there are long-term DH questions for him. Maybe I could say, get ready to learn first base, buddy, depending on what team he signs his major extension with. But if he hits like this, it almost doesn't really matter. I mean, Juan Soto, he's well on his way to a Hall of Fame career and being considered one of the inner circle great pure hitters in all of Major League history. 8 F4 on the year puts him inside the top 5. Number 5, Freddie Freeman, same ranking as MLB Network in this case. Kind of a weird year for him. Obviously his son had a pretty serious health scare that he's still building back from, and that caused him to miss some time in the middle of the season, which is uncharacteristic. And then he has the injury at the end of the regular season, and yet it all culminates in him winning World Series MVP seemingly out of nowhere after not even being all that involved in the rest of the playoff run. And that World Series MVP really papered over what was the weakest season he's had in a Dodgers uniform, at least regular season. Now, he had set an insanely high standard for himself in 2022 and 2023. Those were, in fact, two of the best years he has ever had in any uniform. 2024, maybe the age is catching up to him just a little bit. Obviously, he dealt with a lot of stuff in his personal life and even injury at the end of the year. But at the end of the day, I'm going to base my 2025 ranking most likely off of these 147 games rather than, 4 home runs in 5 games for the Dodgers in the World Series. 137 WRC plus, 282 average, 378 on base, 476 slug. It's not like these numbers are terrible. These are still really good numbers. These are still numbers befitting of a top 50 player in Major League Baseball, just maybe not a top 5 player in Major League Baseball. 22 homers and 9 steals, 4 F4 on the year for Mr. Freddie Freeman. If he starts to decline right now, actually, if he does nothing for the rest of this Dodgers contract, he's already paid it off because of how good he was in the regular season, 2022, 2023, and 2024, and then, of course, the World Series this year. He's already paid it off. Everything else is just playing with house money at this point in terms of his career. Number 4, Corey Seager. Here's what I do when making every single Foolish 50. I ask myself, where would a rational person rank Corey Seager among all the players in Major League Baseball? And the rational person would maybe put Corey Seager here, and then I just go, bloop, 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 move him up, move him up. I love Corey Seager. I had him ranked as the 4th best player in Major League Baseball heading into this season. How did that work out for me? All right, listen, everybody, let's huddle up here. Let's huddle up and let's get one thing straight. I know he didn't quite play a full season once again this year, but a shortstop who hits .278 with a .353 on base and a .512 slug is a really, really, really good baseball player. I don't know if he ends up in the top 5 going into next year's list. I kind of doubt he does, but I love me some Corey Seager. 140 WRC plus. The defense is honestly underrated. He has had this reputation as being, a below average defensive shortstop, and yet at times he has played average shortstop defense, which is very valuable. And, these hitting stats, at least on a rate basis, very comparable to what Lindor did this year. The only difference is, Lindor, of course, steals bases and does play better defense. He plays elite defense, but Seager's just an excellent player. In 2023, he had one of the best offensive seasons for a shortstop ever. This does represent a step back, but this is still an excellent slash line, and there's a lot to get excited about here. 4.5 F4 in 123 games. That gets him probably to, 5.5 or so across a full season. Excellent player. Corey Seager, a little bit of a disappointing year for the Texas Rangers as a whole, but gosh darn it, I still love him, and I'm ready to just bump him up the list higher than you think, higher than your expectations. I'm going to say something here. I might come across as a hater, but that's not my intention. I'm glad this Mookie Betts at shortstop business appears to be over. It kind of put me in a bind where I had to rank him as the number 1 shortstop in Major League Baseball because, well, he's Mookie Betts for crying out loud, yet he'd never really consistently played shortstop, right? I mean, the move to second base to some degree made sense because that's at least what he came through the minor leagues as before switching to becoming one of the greatest defensive corner outfielders of all time, and I'm glad that's where he's going to make his home, hopefully, in 2025. The only reason this isn't a typical Mookie Betts Dodgers season is because he did miss some time. He only played in 116 games, but the slash line right here is right in line with what you would expect for him. 19 home runs, 16 steals, and that -2 fielding run value, expect that to be plus with him switching to right field, hopefully full-time, because he is one of the greatest defensive right fielders ever. He's up there with Clemente, he's up there with Ichiro, and I just would rather see him do that than play out of position at shortstop. 4.4 F4 on the year, kind of similar to Seager. If you extrapolate that across a full season, you're looking at 5.5 to 6. He's a great player. He's Mookie Betts. What more do you want me to say? Ronald Acuña Jr. was MLB Network's number 1 pick going into 2024. They were not alone in this. ESPN does their own version of this list. He was number 1 on that as well. But for me, he was number 2, and it was hard as a Braves fan to watch this season unfold because it went about as badly as it could. He had a slow start, and then he tore his ACL, his second ACL tear of his career, in a different knee this time. Let's talk about Acuña in 2024. The gloating will commence once I reveal who my number 1 pick was, but I do want to talk about Acuña's season. 49 games played, a 105 WRC+, so closer to a league average hitter across those 49 games. Only 4 home runs in those 49 games. You'll recall that he hit 41 home runs last year, so that was a much lower pace, and that results in only 1 F4 before the injury. And I think it really raises some long-term concerns when you're talking about a guy who's had 2 ACL tears in the last few years, 1 in each knee now. This is someone who's reliant on his athleticism. This is someone who, plays the outfield and tries to steal a lot of bases. I just don't know necessarily what to expect here in the long term for Ronald Acuña Jr. He's come back from this type of injury once, but it seems like it will be more difficult to do so a second time. And you'll recall when he did come back from that initial ACL tear in 2022, wasn't all that great of a year for him. 2023, a year removed, with a full healthy offseason. Obviously, we saw what he could do. He could be MVP. I just don't know what to expect for 2025. And so, my number one player in all of Major League Baseball for 2024 was Aaron Judge, and this turned out to be correct. This was the correct call. MLB Network had him at 3, so they even had Mookie ahead of him. Aaron Judge, at least on the regular season, the best player in Major League Baseball this year. And I tell you what, if I could pick one spot on this list to get right every year, it would have to be that number one spot. Statistically, you are looking at one of, if not the best season a right-handed hitter has had in the history of Major League Baseball. I don't want to mince my words. I know he did have a season like this just a couple years ago when he broke the American League home run record. Didn't quite get there this year with 58 home runs, but on a rate basis, probably a better hitter overall. 322 average, 458 on base, 701 slug, adds up to a 218 WRC plus. Unbelievable numbers. If there's one thing I can point to, it's the fielding run value at -3. Yankees again asked him to play a lot of center field this year, and he looks worse out there than he did even back in 2022 when he played a fair bit of center field as well. A big reason why I ranked Judge ahead of Acuña is because of a perceived gap in their potential defensive value. Acuña post ACL tear is not a very confident outfielder. He has a great arm, but the way he moves in the outfield does not look great. Judge, on the other hand, never that graceful because he's so big, but had at least at times played close to a league average-ish center field, and so I thought big gap there between league average center field versus below average, corner outfield. I think Judge, it's probably in his best interest to move back to a corner outfield spot going forward. Yankees will have to figure out what to do with that. They'll have to, the Soto free agency, for example, may inform their decision with how they align their outfield, but it's an 11-WAR season. And so I think we can kind of excuse what happened there on the defense. I don't want to focus on that too much. That's something for me to focus more in terms of 2025. In terms of 2025, by the way, despite the fact that Judge was the best player this year, and I totally got that right, he has some pretty stiff competition for that number one spot. Ohtani will be pitching again, and Bobby Witt Jr. just had a phenomenal year, and he is significantly younger than both Judge and Ohtani. He is seemingly on the upswing of his career, while those guys are both past 30. So it's going to be really fun for 2025 to figure out who the number one player is going to be. But at least this year, I can rest assured knowing I 100% got this one right. An unbelievable season for Aaron Judge. And now it's time for the gloating. I have turned to the absolute cesspit of the internet, the worst place you could possibly go, Instagram Reels comments. As some of you know, I like to appear on Awake and Jake. I appeared there about 2 times a month throughout the season. You can go back and watch some of my previous appearances on the Awake and Jake channel. And after the Foolish 50 was released, one thing we do is, he'll get on there and start asking me some questions. And in this short, I'm talking about the difference between Acuña and Judge and why I ultimately went with Judge as number one versus Acuña, even though, Judge had an injury-shortened 2023 and Acuña, had the whole 40-70 MVP thing going on. So let's go through the comments here. I'm going to take a few minutes. I'm just going to really enjoy this. These are public Instagram comments. Let's have a little bit of self-reflection, people. Let's admit that you were wrong and you don't know ball. And I was right, and I understand sphere. LMAO, are you serious? I'm a Yankee fan, but he's on drugs. Definitely not a Yankees fan saying this. Tell me you're a Yankees fan without telling me you're a Yankees fan. I'm a Braves fan. Acuña's injury. Judge can't make it through a full season without getting hurt. Shut up, dork. No, you shut up. The foolish baseball fall-off has to be studied. You were never on in the first place. Acuña made his own club. Case closed. I don't know, Ohtani did something pretty cool just 1 year later. Stephen A. Smith in the making. Not a compliment. Yes, that is a compliment. Need to raise the price of podcasting equipment. Shut up. Shut up. You were wrong, and I was right. Bro, what is this guy on? I'm on one. Who is this guy? I'm him.
This is what happens when you're smart and he's wearing glasses and he's doing numbers and he's ruining baseball.
Oh, let's get to the hidden comments. I'm sure those are great for me. Delusional, nerd, meat rider, clown, moron, this guy stinks, idiot, farming for comments, idiot again, delusional again. All right, no more engaging with Instagram bozos. I've been wrong plenty of times before. I'm sure I'll be humbled at some point in the future. But let's talk about MLB Network. I started this list 4 years ago as really an alternative to what MLB Network was doing. I didn't necessarily think it was bad. I just kind of wanted to do a version of it for my own. And these are disagreements. These are players who we both had ranked on our respective top 50s. I will point out MLB Network does a top 100, but these were in our top 50, yet the placement on the list was different. So in the left column, you see my ranking, right column theirs. And what constitutes a disagreement depends on where you are in the list, right? Because I determined that my Mike Trout at 8 and their Mike Trout at 12, or my Ohtani at 9 and their Ohtani at 4, I determined that was a significant difference. I wouldn't feel that way about the difference between 45 and 50. So, the amount of spots needed to determine a significant disagreement shrinks, the higher you go up into the list. So these are players that we disagreed on, at least by a decent amount of spots relative to where they were positioned. And we're going to essentially grade them. Who did better in terms of 2024 performance with regards to these rankings. And so we have a grading system. There you go. My apologies to the red-green colorblind, but this is color-coded. Yellow is just sort of in between. It's sort of neutral. Like Trea Turner, you could argue him as the 16th best player or the 26th best player. No one really got an advantage over anyone with that pick. The red ones are bad for me. So Michael Harris II did not have a top 50 year necessarily. I had him at 35. MLB Network had him at 50, so MLB Network did a better ranking, and so he is colored in the red. MLB Network gets points for that, and I will take credit for the greens. So starting with Gerrit Cole, I threw that one out. I had access to recent information. I knew about the injury. MLB Network's list came out before the injury, so that gets tossed out. Arenado, I gain a point there because I had him at 48 versus 33, and he did not have a great year. Luis Robert Jr., same thing. I had him at 38, which was lower than MLB Network's 27, so I take some credit there. Even though we were both wrong to have him on the list, it's more about, relative to each other in this competition. And then we've got ones where I went wrong, and this is where I start to look like a biased Braves fan, maybe just a little bit, despite the fact that I had Judge over Acuña. Michael Harris II, my 35 is worse than their 50. Sean Murphy, my 33 is worse than their 47. Then we've got some neutral guys. You could argue Alex Bregman at 30. You could argue him at 44. You could argue Logan Webb at 29. You could argue him at 42. Corbin Carroll, I took some credit there. My 27 is more accurate than their 18. Trea Turner, that's a neutral one. Zack Wheeler, I give them I give myself the credit there. Even though I thought maybe I underranked him, 21 versus 28, I will take the credit there. Corbin Burnes, I left as a yellow. That is a 20 versus 29. Maybe I should have given MLB Network the credit on that one. I may have to go back and think about that one again. Kyle Tucker, it was only half a year, but I still like my 17 more than their 23. And I think one indicator of success is going to be if they're forced to move him higher than 23 or even higher than 17 going into next year's iteration of the list. And I suspect they will. I suspect he'll be more in line with my ranking than their ranking from this year. Lindor, that one's pretty obvious. My 15 is better than their 25. Ohtani, their 4 is better than my 9. I think Ohtani really did end up being about the 4th most valuable player in baseball this year, so my 9 looks bad. Trout, 8 versus 12. Again, they get the advantage over me, but with Aaron Judge, them ranking him at 3 and me ranking him at 1, I will take a point there. So the end result on aggregate is a +3 for me ahead of MLB Network.Maybe you could argue Corbin Burnes in their favor, but yet at the same time, I think you could maybe argue Logan Webb in my favor. It all cancels out. I'm going to call it a +3 based on our disagreements. These are players that we both had on our 50, but not necessarily in the same tiers. But that's not all, because there are, of course, unique inclusions, players that were unique to the Foolish 50 or unique to MLB Network's top 50. So these are players that I had on my 50, but not on MLB Network's top 50. At 49, I had Guerrero, 47, Swanson, 44, Nola, 39, Kirby, 37, Contreras, 36, Pablo Lopez. MLB Network's unique inclusions were as followed, so I didn't have these guys on my 50. At 49, they had Sonny Gray. At 46, they had JT Realmuto. At 45, they had Will Smith. At 43, they had Luis Arraez. At 40, they had Randy Arozarena. And at 30, they had Blake Snell. And then the question I had to ask myself was, did these players have what one could justify as a top 50 season? And that doesn't necessarily mean they had to be objectively a top 50 player, but could you, Shark Tank pitch me on this player being a top 50 player in 2024? Could you make the argument at the very least? And you could make the argument for probably 70 or 80 guys, if I'm guessing, but who could possibly have that argument for top 50? That is what will determine who gets the points where. It's a similar color coding process, although I might have made it a little more confusing because the green doesn't necessarily good for me as it did last time. It just means good. Green is good, red is bad, yellow is in between. It's sort of neutral. So I ultimately determine, yes, I think you can make an argument Vladimir Guerrero Jr. had a top 50 season. That's a pretty obvious one. I mean, I think he was the best first baseman in baseball this year. Swanson went back and forth on a little bit, but he was top 50 in F4, so it's a simple argument. It's not necessarily an argument I'd love to make, but it's there. William Contreras, an obvious green for me. Aaron Nola and George Kirby, I determined as neutral. You might have a hard time making the argument, but it's not like they were necessarily bad. They were certainly above average. I felt the same way about Sonny Gray on MLB's behalf, even though maybe he was even a little worse than these two guys were. But I felt like, yeah, it's not terrible. You could maybe make the argument, and if I had a few beers in me, maybe I'd listen. The Reds, these are the players that did not make the top 50 or, would not be justified as being in a top 50 list. Not the Cincinnati Reds, just the players colored in red. Pablo Lopez, I love him. I don't really think I could make the argument for his inclusion with hindsight. Same thing with JT Realmuto. Don't think I could make that argument. Will Smith was the closest to a yellow for me. We'll look at Will Smith's numbers later on. He was like a just miss guy on the list, included on MLB Network's. Luis Arias, we may have some sabermetric type disagreements, but ultimately I think, you're looking at a guy who, if you're looking at a WRC plus or an OPS plus, it was only maybe a little bit above average this year and doesn't have much defensive value or base running value to speak of. I think it's pretty fair to not count him as a top 50 player this year. Rosarena has had better years. And then I gave him a green on Blake Snell because even though Blake Snell had the slow start and obviously he signed late and he didn't have a spring training and he was really bad, he just had a great second half to the year. He looked like, the Cy Young winner, Blake Snell. He ultimately pitched well enough to opt out. Even if the full season stats weren't awesome, I felt like you could justify him being a top 50 player in 2024 and honestly in 2025. Taking a look here, that's a +2 for me because I got 3 greens to just 1 red, so that's a +2, and it's a -3 for MLB Network. They only get 1 green on Blake Snell, but 4 reds here. I don't think either of these guys, these 4, would necessarily be justifiable as top 50 players based on their performance in 2024. So that's an aggregate of +5 for me, which if you combine with the disagreements aggregate score, gives me a final aggregate total of +8. This is kind of what I meant at the beginning of the video. In some ways, this was my worst list. In some ways, this was my best list. I think this was a bad list in the sense that I got a lot of picks wrong this year. I think that might be because maybe this year, just based on the results, was harder to predict than previous years. Maybe just, the star players that you'd expect to be good weren't as good as you might thought. Maybe there were more surprise breakouts. I don't know, but it just didn't feel great when I was going through a lot of the list, especially like the 30s and the 40s. Some of the position players were bad and some of the pitchers were a little underwhelming. It did tend to get better as it rolled along. And of course, I finished with Judge at 1, which means I finished strong, but it's a final aggregate of +8, which I think is a very good score compared to MLB Network. Maybe it's not the most scientific approach to grading our list versus the one at MLB Network, but it's the one I came up with. It's the one that I could, do feasibly in a short amount of time, and +8 is a good outcome. This makes me confident that I did better than MLB Network, but did I do great overall? I think that's for you guys to decide. I've gone ahead and put together cards for 12 more players I want to talk about. You could call this section honorable mentions. It's not necessarily players who just missed making the top 50, although there are a few of those and we will talk about them. I'll also be talking about players who weren't under heavy consideration for the 50, but had really good years and thus will be under consideration for the 2025 iteration of the list. Just kind of a fun mix of players that I thought were worth talking about for one reason or another. If you want more of a deep dive specifically on the process and you want me to really get into the gory details of who barely just missed and how did I have, certain positions ranked, I'm going to do a Patreon video. Head on over to the Patreon right now. It'll be up. It'll go live right as this reaction video is going live. And you'll be able to see all my notes, all my spreadsheets, everything that culminated in building the 50 for this year. But I do want to start with the first sort of honorable mention, which I guess is Paul Skeens. Paul Skeens was probably the best starter in baseball on a rate basis this year. We're talking about a sub-2 ERA. These ratios in strikeouts, walks, and home runs are absolutely pristine. He's just been recently named a NL Cy Young finalist, despite the fact that he was, not on the opening day roster for the Pirates and then was load managed a little bit throughout the season, so only 23 starts, 133 innings pitched. I look at the 102 Stuff Plus, and sometimes I think maybe there's a weakness in the Stuff Plus model where it's too reliant on fastball shape, and his fastball shape isn't necessarily ideal at times, but he just throws it so gosh darn hard, sometimes it doesn't really matter. He's an amazing pitcher. He will almost undoubtedly be on the 50. I think he'll be ranked pretty darn high on the 50 if I had to guess, although I'll have to deep dive in on him, but he is the new Riz King. He did Riz up Livy. He had 4.3 F4 on the year. He's probably going to win Rookie of the Year, so way to go, Paul Skeens. Not someone I would have considered for the list, a year ago, but of course will be under consideration for the 2025 iteration. Next up is Chris Sale, and you know what? I'm fine. I didn't have Chris Sale on the list, but I did have him as one of the 5 pitchers I liked for the 2024 season, and that was pretty much all I could do reasonably, and he's going to seemingly win the NL Cy Young Award this year. 29 games started, 177 innings pitched, 2.39 ERA, 2.09 FIP, and because F4 is based on FIP, he had 6.4 F4. I believe that led all Major League starters. So, will he make the 50 guaranteed next year? I don't think you can guarantee that necessarily. I have had a history of leaving reigning Cy Young winners off the 50. I left Snell off last year. I left Verlander off after he won. I left Robbie Ray off after he won. So I'm not saying that this Cy Young win necessarily guarantees an appearance on the 50, but for now I've just got to say, hey, at least I had him as one of the 5 pitchers I like, which is really all I could have reasonably done preseason. Now this Cy Young season, this is the one that hurts. Tarik Skubal. This is the one that hurts because Tarik Skubal was what I would call like a fake dark horse. Like a lot of people were like, and I think Tarik Skubal is going to be my dark horse pick for the Cy Young Award this year. Except if you look at the gambling odds, and don't do everything off the gambling odds, but he was like the 4th or 5th best odds to win the Cy Young Award in the American League. He had such a great, particularly second half to 2023. He finished so strong. He looked like such an ace. And, he's actually, I think, 4th or 5th best odds, but like maybe most bet on player to win the Cy Young Award in the American League. And you know what? That's what he's going to do. So good on you if you did that. 192 innings pitched, great ratios, 2.39 ERA, 2.49 FIP, 5.9 F4. Where did it go wrong? Why did I not have Tarik Skubal on my list? I think the biggest thing I could point to, just philosophically for me, lack of imagination. I hate to say it, but for me, there has been this attitude that you have to prove that you can throw 180 innings or so for me to put you on the 50. And maybe that needs to go the way of the dinosaur. Luis Robert Jr. was someone who on last year's iteration of the list I had a lot of success with. He had never played a full season in Major League Baseball, not a full 162 or anything like that. And then he had a top 50 season and it was 5 F4. And maybe I'm being inconsistent with how I'm applying that to pitchers because there are pitchers who can add innings, right? Even Skubal in 2023, when he was pitching so great down the stretch, he was like a 5.5 inning per start guy. This year, he was, more like a 6 inning per start guy, and that's a big difference. That's why he threw 192 innings. It was just a workload thing. And I wish I could stand here and say, well, Tarik Skubal, he was like my 51 on the list. He just barely missed. No, unfortunately, I had a couple pitchers ranked ahead of him who also weren't on the list. So double whammy there. Let's talk about one of those pitchers who I had ranked ahead of Tarik Skubal. Oh wait, sorry, first some viewer feedback. I get why Tarik Skubal wasn't included, but I feel like he'll definitely be a player you bring up at the end of the reaction video, which is where we are now, as someone you should have included, which is what I'm doing right now. The rest of these comments, same sort of sentiment. They like Tarik Skubal. They were right. I was wrong. That's okay. Oh, look at this one too. You will look foolish for leaving 2024 AL Cy Young winner Tarik Skubal off this list. You, sir, no ball. But here's a guy I did have ranked ahead of Tarik Skubal, Yoshinobu Yamamoto. Wasn't on the list, but he was basically like 51 or 52 for me. I was really thinking about giving him the 50 spot. I thought maybe after the Cole injury, I would just leave Cole off the list, put Yamamoto on there. It would have been a fun discussion point. It would have been a fun way to kick off the list. Oh my gosh, you're putting a guy in the top 50 who has never pitched in Major League Baseball before. That didn't happen. I left him off the list. It was ultimately okay, but I wonder if maybe he could contend for a spot in that list for 2025. Workload was kind of going to be a thing for me, transitioning from NPB to MLB. He's thrown a lot of innings in NPB, but, they're throwing a more like a six-man rotation type of schedule in NPB, so, he has to deal with that. Coming over, he has an injury mid-season. It ends up with 18 games started, 90 innings pitched, so that's only 5 innings to start. On a rate basis, brilliant. Strikeouts, walks, home runs, FIP, ERA, brilliant. All brilliant. 2.8 F4 and 18 starts. That's very, very good. The reason I also doubted him, besides, just this sort of being a transition year for him, is, and this was a complete misread of the situation, by the way, the slow curve. He throws the big, looping, slow curve. That's something that's kind of fallen out of style in Major League Baseball, and so I wasn't so sure. I was like, if hitters just sit on that, they might just crush it, And that turned out to be completely wrong. It was a great pitch for him all year. And I think just maybe because it has fallen out of style, that almost made it more effective for him. So I was wrong about Yoshinobu Yamamoto in some ways, and I look forward to assessing his, half season or so of performance, plus the playoffs as well, with regards to his placement potentially on the 2025 Foolish 50. Matt Chapman was also a just miss for me. I think people might be surprised by that. He didn't exactly kill it during his time with the Toronto Blue Jays, but he was under heavy consideration for me. I liked a lot of the batted ball data for him. He probably would have been, 52 or 53 on a foolish 60 if such a thing could possibly exist. And my instincts were right. I actually would have looked really, really smart if I included him on the list, though if I did, it might have been at the expense of someone like Vladimir Guerrero Jr. So, hindsight 2020, but this was a wonderful year for him. His best season since he was in Oakland A, 647 plate appearances, a 121 WRC plus, 27 homers, 15 steals. The defensive metrics liked him. They've, of course, liked him very early on in his career, but this is maybe the most they've liked him in a while. It adds up to 5.5 F4. He was firmly a top 50 player. Buster Posey already worked out the extension for him with the Giants. He's now running the show over there. So I'm excited for Matt Chapman. And Matt Chapman, here's my thing. Can you please hit 30 home runs? Can you please hit 30 home runs in a season for the Giants? That hasn't happened since Barry Bonds. I just need that stat to be over. Carlos Correa ranked very high for me on the 2023 iteration of the list. I actually think I had him as my number one shortstop in Major League Baseball. He had a bad sort of injury-riddled year, and as a result, I dropped him and I gave up on him, and maybe I was wrong to do so because even though he only played 86 games this year for the Twins, he was really good. This is a season kind of like the Kyle Tucker season we talked about, where here's a guy who didn't have a great full year, but he sure had a great half a year. And Correa has had seasons like this before in Houston where, he plays, 80, 90 games and he just crushes it. A 155 WRC plus, 14 home runs, plus defense at shortstop, 4 WAR in 86 games. He will be one to consider moving on into 2025. Will Smith, also a just miss for me. He was my top-ranked catcher who was still on the board, if that makes sense. Full transparency, after that, it was Cal Raleigh, who actually had a better year than Smith and better year than a lot of catchers in Major League Baseball. And then it would have been Real Muto, who had been consensus number one catcher until fairly recently. Will Smith, this is a good year. He's a good player. And yet this is a little bit below the standard that he has set for himself in his big league career. Did sign a nice big extension with the Dodgers, though. In the end, 128 games played, a 111 WRC+. plus. Believe it or not, he's such a good offensive catcher. This represents essentially a career low in a lot of ways offensively. 20 home runs. His defense is something that he's worked hard on. StatCast didn't necessarily like it this year. They have him at a -5 according to the fielding run value. That is based on his framing, that is based on his blocking, and that is also based on his ability to control the run game. -5, not a great result right there. At the end of the day, 2.7 F4 season. I think I would make the argument that this is not a top 50 season, yet I'll still do a deep dive and give him his due diligence going into 2025. Was Ketel Marte under consideration for this list? Yes, he absolutely was. Was he my top-ranked second baseman still remaining on the board? No. Xander Bogaerts was. So, whiff there on Ketel Marte. Again, a player who I would have looked smarter to have on this list. He's actually just been announced as an MVP finalist in the National League. Good for him. And, he's bounced around positionally some. He got moved to center field, and it looked really smart. And then now he's moved back to the infield, playing second base. It looks really smart there, too. +6 fielding run value there. 36 home runs on the year. My goodness, 292 average, 372 slug, 372 on base, 560 slug, 6 F4. Unbelievable year for Ketel Marte. Obviously will be under heavy consideration for next year's list. Brandon Nimmo was a just miss for me. He was the top-ranked outfielder still on the board when the list was said and done, and ultimately, despite the fact that he was very good in 2023 when I had him ranked in the top 50, left him off the list, and it seems to have worked out just fine. Took a little bit of a step back offensively, 109 WRC+. The fielding run value was interesting for me because I had really been sold on his center field defense. That was one reason why he was included on the 50 in 2023, for example. This year, the Mets go out and they sign Harrison Bader, and that makes me think, It just made me think, And I think that's a big reason why he wasn't on this list. He moves to playing more corner outfield, and even then, close to a league average outfielder when it's all said and done. 2.7 F4. I would make the argument, not a top 50 player, and thus a reasonable omission. Jarren Duran, I believe, had the most WAR of any player not included on the Foolish 50. That's something I can live with because that's not a guy I would have considered coming into the season anyways. He just had an absolutely monster year. 129 WRC+, 21 homers, 34 steals. A big highlight is the defense in center field. +12 fielding run value. StatCast rated him as one of the best defensive outfielders. This is a guy who came up and was just standing there like this, and the ball would just drop behind him. He had just so many kind of funny misplays in the outfield as a rookie, and now he has just really developed into being a complete player. 6.7 F4 on the year. What's funny is, as great as this season was, I don't necessarily feel like it guarantees his inclusion on the list for 2025. That's something I'm going to have to do a deep dive on. There are guys like that. There are guys who can put up a lot of WAR. They can put up top 50 WAR, but maybe it'd have a harder time considering them as top 50 players. I don't know. I'm just not guaranteeing it is all. I don't like to make guarantees at this point in the season anyways. 160 games played. Why not the full 162? Elly De La Cruz, he was considered, though not heavily. I don't think he would have even made a foolish 60 necessarily, but I did think about him. I did lie awake at night and think, Elly De La Cruz, he strikes out a lot, but golly, is he athletic. And, he didn't necessarily do away with all his flaws this year, but it's just like his flaws didn't matter. He was an amazing player, having an amazing season. Kind of similar numbers to Jarren Duran in a way, just a sort of different shape to them. 118 WRC+. Excellent defense at shortstop, which was a lot of fun to watch. 25 homers, a league-leading 67 stolen bases, adds up to a 6 F4 season. I would feel more confident about him appearing on the list than Jarren Duran. But yeah, it was just a lot of fun to watch both those guys. And we do have some Elly feedback from 7 months ago. This commenter, John, says, I think Elly De La Cruz is going to have a breakout season. And that's exactly what happened. This commenter concurs, can't wait for a full season of Elly. And I'll finish up these honorable mentions with Jackson Merrill. Boy, oh boy, what an amazing rookie year for him. I think Paul Skeens is going to beat him. I think Paul Skeens is going to take home that award, but this was a wonderful rookie season. This was a rookie season. We've talked about this with some of the AL MVP stuff that was probably better than the median rookie of the year winner over the last 20 years or so. We're talking about a 500 slug in Petco as a rookie, as a center fielder playing center field for basically the first time. He goes +10 fielding runs, combine that with 24 homers and 16 steals and some really clutch hits along the way. away for a playoff-bound San Diego Padres team. 5.3 FWAR. This was a wonderful rookie season for Jackson Merrill. There are some other good rookie seasons. Churio, I was impressed with him. Colton Cowser, it seems, will win American League Rookie of the Year. I don't know if Colton Cowser is going to be on this list for sure. I left Michael Harris off for what was ultimately, I think, a more impressive rookie season a couple years ago. Jackson Merrill, though, I feel pretty good about. I expect we will see him on next year's iteration of the list. If your favorite player wasn't on the Foolish 50 or in those honorable mentions, don't sweat it. That's not everybody who had a top 50 season. That's not everyone who could be new to the list in 2025. Those were just some players I felt like highlighting. And another thing I feel like highlighting, look at this green screen technology. Look how I can live inside of the computer. That ain't cheap. It costs thousands of dollars for me to run this green screen technology, very advanced Hollywood special effects. It's certainly not a green screen that a company gave me for free. It's certainly not that, and that I only use once a year for this video. That's certainly not the situation. If you want to support me and support green screen technology so I can live inside of the computer forever, head on over to patreon.com/foolishbaseball. You can support me throughout the off season. Next month in December, one thing I do for fun is I take my monthly earnings and I donate them all to charity, some baseball related, some not baseball related, some local and near and dear to my heart, some, helping people halfway around the world. We just kind of spread it out. We spread the love. You will get access to things like, here's a lost episode of Baseball Bits about the 2018 World Series. It's a few years old, but there it is. How about, obviously I post my Baseball Bits on there and let everyone just check that out. There's work in progress updates, so you could have known what I was working on a few days before it actually came out. There's video Q&A. There's one from October. There's, more Baseball Bits. And also for this month, going up right now, I have a Patreon exclusive video that's going to be more about how I built the list. So that's pretty cool. I'm going to show you how I built the list. Oh my goodness, look at this spreadsheet. What is he doing with this spreadsheet? I'd like to know. I'd like to pledge $5 a month. And look, if you cancel the subscription by the end of November, you won't even get charged. You won't even get charged until December 1st. So there you go. There's my Patreon commercial. Help me out. Please, please, pretty please, pretty please with sugar on top.